I'm going to start with why I design with a story in mind. Picture this first. So saying you find a letter. And from this letter, it's got beautiful penmanship. It's written on hotel stationery. It's written by an anonymous person. And you start to read it, and it starts with, when I arrived, I was greeted with luxury. This sophistication and opulence that I knew was going to be good for me, right? That I just needed to embrace and relax and enjoy. Now, I'm not one for plush robes and matching slippers, but I find when I'm in a hotel, I always wear them and lay on the crisp duvet in the nice hotel suite. I order room service, fresh fruits and vegetables. It's got a raspberry vinaigrette. The sounds, the smells liven me. Later, I decide to hop in the bath. The water's warm, and I fill it up to the very brim because it feels more opulent, feels more exquisite. I listen to my breath. I hear the water lapping against the sides of the tub. Later, I get out, and the room is lonely. It's quiet. It gives me a moment of pensiveness. I listen to the city sounds down below, and I think about all the places that I would explore tomorrow. And then I wrap up that piece of paper, and I hide it away someplace so I can look at it later, my secret experience. This letter, signed anonymous. That is the premise of a project that I worked on recently that I'm going to share with you. So what I'm going to do tonight is talk about how I use storytelling in editorial design, personal projects, and or commercial projects. And I'll go through a couple of my samples of recent projects that I've worked on to kind of demonstrate how I've used each one of those. The story that I just mentioned to you became exactly this. The premise of a book project that I was working on. A photographer came to me who was going to work on his very first monograph, a fashion photographer. And he says, hey, I'm doing this series of visual essays, photographic essays, and I want to put it together. And I said, okay, so let's talk about your imagery. Let's talk about what you're trying to do. And he gave me the rundown where he was going to shoot fashion models in these luxurious hotel suites all over the globe. And he was going to take these 2 years to basically go do this. And I said, okay, sure. I go, what else? And he says, well, that's it. And I said, nah, that's not good enough for me. So I pushed him. I said, what's the story? What's the narrative? What's the depth? What's the thing that an audience can relate to? And so that's where I came back to that story that I just told you, which became the preface of the book, the opening essay for the book, which I insisted upon because if we're going to do this book, it's got to have something stronger that we can relate to, something that holds it in context. I was very insistent upon that we have something that we can wrap our arms around, and especially because we were going to do a story about women in hotel rooms, and we were going to be the voyeurs that come in and see their intimate environments. I didn't want to objectify them. To me, that would be wrong. So I found a way that we can actually put these stories in context. And so that became a very literal interpretation of how I use storytelling in design as the launching point for putting the project in context. And then what I go back and do is I figure out how to find what the visual elements are to kind of reinforce that story. This is the book project. It was called My Hotel Room. And as the photographer went around and shot, we always kind of came back and we circled back to what's the story, what's the narrative, what is that bit of luxury, what is that plush robe, those matching slippers, what is that warm tub and that fresh fruit that we have? How do we describe that, but not make it overtly sexualized, that wasn't exploiting the models, but it became a very intimate view of it. And so what I started to do is look at not only the story, but the visual elements that I was going to use, the technique, the graphics, the materials, the production aspects. And so one of the first things we started to do is look at the photographs that we have. And we started to look at some of the materials in the environment. And I started to select design elements and materials that would match that. I was looking at things in the sofa and the fabrics and the lights outside. So going back to this original essay that we opened the story with, we decided to create a logo that was very similar to like hotel stationery being one of the graphics that we would start to pull in. We would wrap the book in silk that would match some of the imagery. What I'm getting into now is showing you how I use some of the storytelling elements to inform some of the design choices. The opening story that I told you about, where we find this anonymous writer in a hotel room writing this secret letter. Again, we just decided, let's just use it as the opening essay to really put this thing in context. And so that became the opening of the book, demonstrated here, signed anonymous from an unknown hotel location. From the interior of the book, what we got into was creating more of a branding for each of the story essays. So each story would be accompanied by a graphical element that we would treat to enhance more of an editorial, advertising, magazine point of view to give it some strength. We would give a nod to the hotel, to the environment. We would go back and tell brief stories with text without in the internals of the book to talk about like these environments. So if this one's in Hong Kong, we would go and talk about like the specific traits for each one of those to put it again in context, not to see that we're exploiting anything, but how we're bringing those intimate environments back to those specific cultures. This is the exterior of the book, again looking at how we used a very silk fabric and a two-piece wrap of the book, created a little bit of a logo stamping for the project itself to kind of tie back into this whole notion of this secret message that's written on the hotel stationery. So that's an example of how I use story in a very literal way on an editorial project for this monograph for this photographer. What I want to talk about next is how you can use the same principles for personal work, personal design work, which is I always like to explore personal work because that personal work allows me the freedom to do whatever I want to do. And quite often clients will say, hey, I love your personal work. Can you do something like that for my work, for my clients? The next project was a piece that I was interested in from an illustrative point of view, but also from a social point of view. It was right around the time when the last election, and we're continually fighting for rights of individuals in this country, right? And it was right around the time of the election, the Women's March was kind of kicking up, and myself and a bunch of friends decided we were going to go. In fact, it was one of my female friends. She says, for my birthday, all I want to do is all of us to go down there and go to the march. I'm like, that's cool. We'll do that for your birthday. So as a part of it, I wanted to design posters for everybody. And so as I started designing it, I'm like, what's my message? What's my point of view? What do I want to create? And as I went down and engaged in the march, I started to realize that everybody had a different point of view and a different message. Some people were very aggressive. Some people were about equal rights. Some people were about different things. Even little girls were there talking about what they wanted to do when they grow up. So I started to see that this project, which started as just posters for this event, became like a bigger social cause that I really wanted to address. And I wanted to address it in a very positive way. So I started to think about what's the story that I want to tell, who do I want to tell it to, what's the tone that I want to use. And for me, I always try to take a more positive tone. I think a lot in design, people talk about problem solution, what's the pain points, and that's not necessarily my methodology. I like to talk about what's the positive attribute of it. And so what I eventually came to was the message that I wanted to say, which was inclusivity, which was how we're better as a whole if we work collectively together, that if we work together and we have an open dialogue and a better understanding of one another, that it becomes a better situation for all. So that's essentially became the story and the premise that I wanted to create. And I eventually settled on the phrase, we stand united, be an uprising of love, for the premise that I wanted to couch this narrative about this holistic thing that we were going to gather collectively. So using the icon of the pink pussy hat as a reference point, I said, how can I extend this to multiple demographics to show that they are united and standing on a unique consolidated front? So using that as the premise and this positivity and this messaging of standing united, I started to roll it out to different demographics. I researched all the different demographics that I wanted to showcase together. And I wanted to juxtapose them side by side because that was pretty important for me to actually show how they were all together. So people that you wouldn't necessarily see together, that became like the premise of this. How do we tell a story that they're all kind of standing together? So this eventually became a personal project that I started to roll out to about 40 or 50 poster designs at this point. And since it's been acquired or requested by the Center of Study for Political Posters, that actually exists. It's actually in Santa Monica, California. It is, as I hear, the largest collection of political posters in the world in Santa Monica, and they called me up and they wanted to add this to their collection. So right now, this is kind of going to be received into that museum as a collection of political posters, which I thought was a pretty cool thing, which became a personal project for somebody's birthday to go to the Women's March, to now this collection of posters that really demonstrated a lot of demographics that I really like to look at as the United States as this melting pot, but not only globally, how, like if we cross that platform, how we still are unique. Again, using the color pink to kind of tie everybody together. That's how I use the storytelling in a background way to kind of inform the ideas, inform the story, and to kind of tie everything together. This is me at the march with a longer beard. It's true, I did support it. So the next project I want to talk about goes into more of a commercial realm. This project for me, Truman State University, a little background on it. I went to school here, and I was hired by the university as a student to be a designer for the university. I don't know how, I just did. And at the time, it was called Northeast Missouri State. And as I was graduating, they were investigating how do we make this school seem more prominent. The school was a liberal arts school, which was considered to be the Harvard of the Midwest. Whether that's true or not, it's a small school. Nobody's ever heard of it, but that's what it's called. It's in Missouri, and they wanted to give a nod to Harry Truman, who was from Kansas City, a couple hours away. So as they were in the process of doing this investigation about how they were going to rebrand the school, they were going out to big agencies in Chicago and St. Louis and Kansas City to basically pitch. And me being this 21, 22-year-old kid just graduating, I was like, can I throw my hat in the ring? And they're like, no, we're bidding it out to other people, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, I convinced them to let me just throw some ideas into the mix. And what I realized is that most of these big studios and agencies didn't have the insight that I had. I knew the background of this story. I knew the history, that this school was established in the early 1900s, was a teacher's college, became a regional school, then became a liberal arts school, and then it became what I mentioned earlier, the Harvard of the Midwest. They didn't know that. And so what I wanted to do is to take that history, that story of its past, that recognition of where it wants to go, and to find those elements and those attributes and those graphical details to tell that story in their new mark. This being the final solution, I wanted to show you a little bit about their history that I knew that other agencies I knew or I suspected did not. So one of the main buildings on the campus was the Kirk Memorial Building, which was the center building. It was one of the early buildings on the property. And it's got an old school gym in it. Like if you see the movie Hoosiers in Indiana, it's still got that old wood floor, and it is the iconic of that. In the basement, they now converted it to a museum for the university. It has a lot of local history. Since it is Missouri, it does have some politically incorrect things, but it's true to it. So, but what I decided to do was take a nod to its history, to its architecture, to its past, and incorporate that into how they're moving forward. So I'm going to point out a piece of architecture on this Kirk Memorial Building called the cupola. And to me, that was an iconic element that was really well known, being this essential piece of architecture on the campus. So I used that as the primary component for my mark. You can see where I eventually came to and the original architecture. As a part of that, we wanted to give it strength. We wanted to give it this educational, academic gravitas to it. I wanted to make a nod to its past with the weather vane, with North, where the school was at the time called Northeast Missouri State, and now it's being called Truman State. So we acknowledge the past, we acknowledge the future, and we give it this elevated aesthetic. We did retain the purple, which was their school colors. I didn't have a choice of that. That's what they wanted to retain, and I can respect that. So that became the main component of the mark itself, this being the final solution and the final cupola graphic itself. Now, I wasn't in the room. They didn't allow me to come to present my ideas. But what I hear is that between all the studios from Chicago and St. Louis and Kansas City is that they all eventually stood in a room with the president of the university and they said, that's the one we want to go with. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I heard. So that's hearsay. Next thing you know, I'm this young 21, 22-year-old guy that gets to rebrand the entire university. But the point of the story is that I used elements of its past, of its history, to inform the design decisions. And I think most other people did not. They weren't familiar with it. And so I had to create that and understand that in order to find the elements that worked with that. Those are 3 examples of work that I've used from editorial, personal, and commercial work, whether it be literal, understanding the personal context of the environment for personal work, or understanding history, and using all of those past stories and narratives to help inform your design choices. But more importantly, to give the work depth, to make it more relatable, to make it more personal. My opinion is that any design solution can be pretty. Anything can be technically well produced. Those should be givens. But unless you can take it a little bit further to give it a narrative, something that's relatable, something that's authentic, it's going to be nothing more than something pretty and technically well produced. That, for me and for my money, is not good enough. And I think that really separates, I think, really good work to really great work. A couple of things that I think about when crafting my story is first understanding who my audience is, knowing them inside and out. What's their likes, what's their dislikes, what are they feeling, what are you trying to communicate to them, what type of person and demographic are they? With the book project, I knew who that audience was. With the We Stand United project, I knew who that audience was in that gender demographic. The commercial Truman State branding identity, I knew who that was with prospective students and to endowments and to other board of governors. The next thing I think about is like, what's the story that I want to tell? Do I want to come at it from a point of positivity? Do I want to come at it from its pain points? Do I want to tell a story that's warm and fuzzy? Do I want to tell a story that is aggressive? Knowing, of course, what my audience is and what they would respond to. So being the third point, understanding the result that you want. How do I want them to respond to this? You can't ever fully understand or predict what the audience, how they will respond to a piece, but what you can do is know what you want your end goal to be, if I want them to respond in a certain way. So knowing what your results are or what the action points are is a good thing to have too. Number 4 there, match the design elements to the tone of the narrative. So meaning, is it color? Is it fonts? Is it materials? Is it production methodology? Is it textual narrative? Is it photography versus illustration? So it's all of those components that actually help enhance the messaging, the story. They have to match the tone. So if you tell a warm and fuzzy tone in your story, but decide to use like neon yellow with very jagged type, they don't kind of match. So finding those graphical elements and those production elements that actually match your story. And Last and most important to me is be authentic. Tell a story truthfully, tell a story honestly, good, bad, or ugly, and be truthful to it. Truthful to it in how you tell it. Be truthful to it in the elements that you use to help demonstrate it. And I think you're often running to a good point. So I look at story as a luxury whenever I get an opportunity to tell a story for a client or for even myself in personal work. I look at it as a luxury. I look at it as that plush robe and those matching slippers that I get to use in order that fresh fruit. And I get to indulge in all of those elements to kind of help tell the best story that I can. So thanks so much. That's how I tell a story and why I design with a story in mind.